Today, what I would like to do is to offer you a certain understanding of the term critical. I will not focus on the criticism of the museum itself. I will not create a very negative picture. Instead, I would like to be critical in the Kantian meaning of the term. So I will basically ask, how does it work? Museums are basically like windshields in cars or screens. If they are well made, we look through them on something else, but we never focus our attention on the screen itself. And today, I would like to present you a template or a method of thinking about museums, focusing on the form rather than a content. And the key idea here will be to examine how this highly contested side of memory uses our five senses to basically take us back in time and allow us to experience another place and another time, just like our virtual tour. So obviously we have to start somewhere. So my idea is to give you direct instructions how to actually get to the museum. So when you come to Warsaw by train, which is very comfortable, please do that. You can take a streetcar to get to the museum. And it makes a lot of sense for the reason I will reveal in a minute or two. If you are very lucky, you can even catch one of these beautiful historical streetcars from the period that run from time to time and allow you to sense the historical spirit even before getting to the museum. When traveling to the museum, make sure to look carefully through the windows, because everything you see is strictly connected to the history we're going to talk about. Because every single building you're passing on your way to the museum was destroyed after the Warsaw Uprising and rebuilt after the war. Actually, if you take one of the possible routes from the central railway station to the museum, you may pass near the region of the former Warsaw Ghetto when the city was leveled down to the ground after the first Warsaw Uprising mentioned today. And one important tip, if you are in Warsaw, please don't forget to see the Warsaw Old Town, which is a marvelous UNESCO heritage site for being the newest old town in the world. Actually, the whole old town was carefully rebuilt brick after brick after the war, and it wouldn't be impressive at all. It's just one of many old towns similar to the other old towns in the region, but it's fascinating how the town was actually rebuilt after the war. And this powerful sense of loss, mourning, rebuilding, and then regaining the memory of destruction is crucial to understand the importance and complicated nature of the museum itself. You will not miss the museum. The building is huge, it's impressive, and the name of the stop when you have to leave your streetcar is Muzeum Powstania Warszawskiego. So there are a lot of clues. The only tricky thing is that the building looks completely different when you look at it from the northwestern side than from the southeastern. It is because, like a lot of contemporary memory museums, it consists of two parts. First, historical post-industrial building, which actually was a power plant for Warsaw streetcars. So another connection to streetcars and energy. And the second part is a new creation built in order to symbolize the city that, despite being leveled down to the ground, never actually lost its brave spirit. And the fact that the building used to be a power plant for the streetcars is really interesting because, as I will try to demonstrate to you today, it actually still is a power plant. It is very strongly focused on generating energy, generating meaning, generating sense. Before 2004, before the museum was opened, there was a huge debate about the Warsaw Uprising. And the key element of this debate was, did it make sense? Was it a reasonable decision? And the possible answer were yes or no. The museum restructured the challenge. Instead of asking whether it made sense, it started making sense, literally generating sense from this source. So today I will demonstrate how, by using 5 senses, this museum still is a power plant that powers a lot of stuff in Poland, in politics, in popular culture, in business also. So let's take a closer look into how these 5 senses are used in the museum. And this will be a very detailed tour, so I will focus on details. And unfortunately, we won't be able to cover the whole exhibition, which is really extremely huge. When you're going to visit Warsaw for real, please remember writing me an email then. I'll be happy to give you some further guidances. Please think about 2-3 hours to visit the museum and have a time to stop at the cafe and the gift shop. And today I will focus on details and will not go through the museum room by room or chronologically. We will skip from one sense to another. And usually, when we think about old traditional museums, sight is definitely the preferred sense because it enables you to analyze, to focus on details. On the other hand, hearing is the sense that usually connects you with your guide and enables creating this sense of community. All of the other senses are either strictly forbidden, like touching the paintings in the official Museum of Paintings, please don't do that, or are accidental, like smell and taste. You do eat stuff in museum cantina, or you smell some funny smells in the museum, but usually they aren't intentional. As you will see, Warsaw Rising Museum being a first and greatest example of the new museology in Poland, consistently and in a very interesting manner uses all 5 senses. So let's start with the most conventional one, the sight. In the Warsaw Rising Museum, you are able to look at many different objects, and there are many places in which you are expected to slow down, take a closer look, read something, see the pictures. Contrary to what have been told to one of our participants by her colleague, all the texts on the exhibition are translated to English. So don't worry about that. You will be able to read and experience everything if you speak English. I hope you do speak English, by the way. And some of the parts are especially prepared for closer analysis, like using these lenses, or a very important map that opens the museum. One of the first things you see when you enter the museum is the map presenting the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which is actually a partition of Poland between Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, which is a recurring theme in the Rising Museum. Sight is also used to create interactivity. You may open some drawers, you may take a closer look into something, but this is the stuff we are familiar with if we visited any other museums. But there are also some interesting new things that were revolutionary, were introduced in the Warsaw Uprising Museum. And first of them was totality of experience. Usually in traditional museums, the part is more important than the whole, the exhibit than the exhibition. Warsaw Uprising Museum was carefully crafted the other way around. So it creates immersive, total experience. And the most interesting example of that is the famous or unfamous Red Corridor, presenting the aftermath of the Warsaw Rising, when the communist propaganda distorted the image of the uprising, creating the memory propaganda mentioned by Maria in the lecture you've just heard. And when you enter the corridor, you see this red light coming directly from the sickle and hammer symbol, and everything is overflown with this red light. It's very powerful symbolic image. And you have to pass through this corridor to get to the cafe, so everybody walks there. And the final clever idea applied in the museum is using obstacles to create a natural mechanism for selection of information. Some very drastic pictures presenting executions done by the Nazis are placed on purpose in a high concrete wells. So if you're not tall enough, you're probably too young to take a closer peek. Obviously, it raises some questions about accessibility for people with disabilities, but at the same time, it's a very interesting idea of creating natural obstacles. And it's everywhere in the museum. You have to open something, you have to look inside something, you have to open the curtains to discover some drastic hidden truth. Another sense, obviously connected to the museum, usually through tour guides and audio guides, is hearing. So first, hearing in the Warsaw Uprising Museum is used to create personal connection to personal narratives. So basically, this is a museum very strongly built on oral history. They have great archive of oral history made just in time, in the very last moment, when they were able to capture a lot of these memories from people who soon died. And there is this clever idea with telephones, that you can pick up a telephone and feel like you were actually listening to a person narrating his or her life in the Warsaw Uprising. As you can see at the picture here, a lot of these people are already gone. So this museum very carefully embodies one of the key ideas of the memory boom. The memory boom starts in the last possible moment for the memory to survive. But this is an obvious trope. So people narrating their stories were already used as a device, mnemonic device, in many other museums. But there are other ideas, more disturbing, used in the Warsaw Uprising Museum. And the most symbolic of them is the so-called beating heart of the uprising. It's a monument inside the museum, creating something like a core or a spine of the building itself. It goes through different levels, and it literally beats like a heart. Boom, 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 boom. And when you can hear the sound in every place of the museum. And when you come closer to the monument and maybe even put your ear on this wall, you can hear voices, street noises, shots. And it's a very literal symbol of traveling in time, but at the same time, it enables us to think about the whole museum, about the whole event as a kind of a heart beating heart of Polish national memory. Again, generator of very powerful energy. And for many of my foreign friends, this was, quote unquote, super creepy, like a horror movie idea. And this is just one of many discrepancies between Polish visitor, most of them find it, oh, an interesting idea, and foreign visitors who ask, what the heck? Then touching in a lot of museums is completely forbidden. In Warsaw Uprising Museum, as I've already mentioned, you have a lot of interactive parts. You have drawers, you have curtains. It creates a very powerful connection and the sense of discovering history yourself. But there is a very important part of sensory experience while visiting the museum, which is usually overlooked. And if there is something you almost never focus on while visiting the museum, it's the floor. And please make sure to notice how cleverly the floor is made in the Warsaw Uprising Museum when you will visit it yourself. So there are large parts in which the floor imitates the cobblestone, the raw cobblestone of the streets of Warsaw. You immediately feel that despite being in a building, you're outside, you are in the city, you are going from one building to another. Then there is this part, for example, with a backyard of a tenement building with this very characteristic chapel, and it's a different cobblestone. It changes. Then you can enter an apartment, and for one moment you are in the interior, and even if you don't notice that, the sound of your shoes, of your steps is different. The scene gets much more cozy, and obviously it's a fake sense of safety. And for example, in a room devoted to the persecutors and the oppressors, the floor is entirely made of steel. And even when there is a person or just a person or two in the room, the steps really resonate, like a marching army creates this strange robot-like feeling. It's a very powerful, immersive experience, literally aiming at transport you somewhere else, outside, inside, metaphorical space, very literal space. Then the sense very rarely used in the museums, except maybe for the museums of perfumes or stuff like that. I know that there's one like this in Paris. Smell creates a super powerful, immersive experience that you really cannot escape. You can close your eyes, you can cover your ears somehow, but smell, good luck with that. And there are two interesting spots on the exhibition where this sense is used. First is the part of exhibition devoted to the massacre of Wola district, the one you will probably be passing through on your way through the streetcar. They don't show drastic pictures. They don't show the victims. They just give you raw data with the exhumation protocols. And it's really strong. You have photocopies of the protocols in the epoch site. You can look at them, you can touch them, and there's this smell. Obviously, it's not a smell of rotting bodies. It's a smell of disinfectants. It's a smell of medicine. It's a smell of, well, the technicalities of exhumation work. And it's very powerful. And the second place is a underground, illegal, obviously, printing house when you smell the printing press and the paint. The smell is very strong on purpose. And by the way, you can use the printing press to print your own leaflets about the Warsaw Uprising, another example of immersive experience. But equally interesting are the places where, despite of the obvious thrill that it would generate, they have decided not to use a smell as a sense. And the most criticized for being, as my co-speaker said, Disneyland of memory. The most criticized part is the recreation of infamous Warsaw sewers that became a part of the battle arena in the uprising. And when 50 years earlier, Andrzej Wajda created his masterpiece, Kanał They Wanted to Live, about the Warsaw Uprising, the actual participants of the uprising were outraged when they realized that the movie was filmed in a comfortable studio and the water was actually warm. It was, like a profanation, that they weren't doing it in actual sewers. So I can imagine that this dry, clean imitation, it's even more disturbing. Why to create it? It's, like a labyrinth for the children. And it's very distant from the real experience. And at the same time, it's obvious that recreating the real experience would not be something reasonable in a museum. And finally, last but not least, taste, which is a super powerful vehicle of nostalgia. Everybody remembers famous Proust Madeleines. That would literally a food that can take you back in time. And usually when you visit a museum, a gift shop or a cafe are like places that are added to the main exhibition. Well, in the Warsaw Rising Museum, there are actually the places when you can experience the time machine philosophy at its best. So you can see a picture from the cafe here, and there is a screenshot presenting the menu. So it says next to the contemporary positions in the menu, you can have the uprising food, like hard tacks with marmalade. Hard tacks are like very, very dry bread you use as military rations. Breads with sardines or lard. You can drink rye coffee, which was a popular ersatz coffee during the uprising. So it's interesting. And to some degree, it's probably also outrageous. By the way, you can also take some of this great taste from the past out with you. You can buy these tiny brass boxes with sweets that are also referring to the sweets that was sold before and during the war. So you can take it home with you. So I'm fully aware that almost everything I've already said was to some degree controversial, but let's sum it up now. So first, as I've mentioned, before 2004, Warsaw Uprising was a highly contested event. And some people claimed that it made no sense, and it resulted in death of over 200,000 people, mainly civilians, and as I've already mentioned, in total destruction of the city. While the other people said that if it weren't for the Warsaw Uprising, Poland would actually become another republic of the Soviet Union, and it was a very important demonstration, and that finally, as my co-speaker mentioned, 55 years later, the war ended with the uprising being victorious when in 1989, after the Solidarity Revolution, Soviet occupation in Poland ended. So the creators of the museum took this contested memory and recreated it into a very different narrative. The narrative, as expressed by aforementioned Lech Kaczyński during the opening of the museum, was there is only one question we should ask ourselves. Why is this museum opened in 2004 and not in 1994 on the 50th anniversary? And he immediately answered the question. because during the transformation, there were people in Poland who wanted us to forget our history, and they are still amongst us. So by opening this museum, we are rooting our politics, our society in this very powerful memory, and we are rejecting the culture of forgetting. It was a very important critique of the political transition, of the political transformation that was prospective, that was focused on future instead of on the past. And it's a very important reason for the current impressive successes of the ruling party that get to power and keeps a very high support in the society. Then obviously, it is done by creating collective memory based on strong emotions. And it's very important to understand that this is a museum that is purposefully built as a part of competing memories. So there are good reasons for which the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was many times mentioned in the questions and during the lecture, because obviously there is competition between these two memories. And I would like to present you a Polish point of view on that. So first, right now, to make it very clear, the Warsaw Rising Museum tries to demonstrate that they are actually aware of the first ghetto uprising in Warsaw, and they have this very interesting series of lectures and events called the City of Two Uprisings. So they acknowledge it, but at the same time, there was this very strong feeling amongst a lot of Polish people that Western countries remember only the first uprising in Warsaw, and they purposefully forget the second one. And actually, I had an adventure like this myself. I was invited guest lecturer at the Collège des Études in Paris, and I was talking to a group of historians, so professionals, and they came to my lecture, and on the name of the lecture was the date 1944. And after 20 minutes of my lecture, I realized that there is a misunderstanding, and they believe that I speak about the ghetto uprising because most of them never heard of the second one. And it was surprising. And when you think about 1970, Willy Brandt's famous Nifol, a lot of people in Poland felt that he commemorated the wrong uprising, that he didn't remember about, quote unquote, our uprising. So it's very important to understand that this very strong collective memory is also created to remind the West about the Warsaw Uprising, because the poor result of the uprising, the massacre, was partially fault of the Western country. This is the official narrative that sold us in Tehran and Yalta, that allowed Stalin to take control. And then, of course, there is the little insurgent, the most controversial probably part. And by the way, it's untrue, just nobody gave little children the guns for a very simple reason. There were too few of them, guns, not children's, for them to be given to children. But it's a fascinating story because I grew up with this figurine. My grandparents, two of my grandfathers were actually insurgents in the Warsaw Uprising, and I knew the figurine since I was born. And I actually remember as a small child even playing with it, recreating one of Polish TV series about four tankmen and a dog. And if I remember, I wasn't even punished for that. So it wasn't like profanation. And then one day I have visited the museum with my Canadian colleague, and she was like, "It's a child soldier." And I was, "No, it's just a little insurgent. It's a very important part of Polish memory. It's a child soldier. You cannot do that." Imagine it was in any other country. How would you react to that? And then I realized that, well, it's a child soldier, and we celebrate it. And there are a lot of parts in this museum. What you can see now is a room for children, for them to play and learn about Warsaw Uprising, learn some songs that were sung in the Warsaw Uprising, and identified with their peers who took part in the uprising, maybe not as soldiers, but as messengers, and a lot of them were shot. So my another foreign colleague said, it looks like Al-Qaeda training camp. I would never use a term like that myself, but it gave me food for thought. Maybe being born in this landscape of memory blinded me for some obvious things, and maybe this blindness is now transmitted to next generations that are risen here. And the transmission is very powerful because the museum recreated the Warsaw Uprising as a powerful cultural franchise. You can buy board games, you can buy t-shirts, and not only in the museum shop. After memory boom for the uprising started in 2004, the PW Encore, which functions, it's officially a symbol of the underground state, but because the letters PW also stand for Powstanie Warszawskie, not only Polska Walcząca, it's often mistaken as quote unquote logo of the Warsaw Uprising. And it became super popular on street fashion, for example, and it's completely out of control. On the picture on bottom right, you can see a baseball bat with the picture of the little insurgent. And one thing you must know is that we don't actually play baseball in Poland, or we don't use balls to play baseball in Poland. You can buy baseball bats, but never balls, because you play Polish baseball without a ball. So it's super complicated. And I really believe, after visiting many similar museums in other countries, that this is not something which is endemic, peculiar to Poland, that you can trace a lot of these tropes probably in contested sites of history in your countries, in your cities. So what I would really love is for you to get two things from this virtual tour. First, it was just a sneak preview. Please come to Warsaw and see it yourself, because it's much better than in my narrative. And second, it would be exciting to use same method to analyze new and old museums in your hometowns. And maybe in the next tour you will be giving will be focused on these 5 senses. You can create, I don't know, special sheets for your students or participants to write the way the 5 different senses are intentionally and unintentionally used in the museum. It opens a lot of possibilities. So traditional museum and Warsaw Rising Museum, or any new museum, you have these differences. Only some senses were used in traditional museums. All senses are used in these modern museums. Exhibit is more important in traditional museums, where exhibition dominates in the modern museums. You have distanced analysis, facts and information in traditional museums, and this point of view, experience, emotion, values, and time machines in new museums. And I really believe that Warsaw Rising Museum can be a very interesting example, but it's not a lone, unique case. So you can use this method in many other places. And I will be super happy to answer all your questions now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Marcin, for this insight and really bringing the museum to life in this like online context. So I gathered the questions from the chat, and first I wanted to come back to the promise I made to Paul Flatter with the question about how the museum deals with the lack of support expected, at least in some circles, from the Allies. So how is that coming back in the museum?
Oh, I've already mentioned it, that Yalta and Tehran are like counterparts for the Warsaw Rising. So Western countries are directly or indirectly blamed for the poor result of the Warsaw Uprising because of their treason. we were left alone, and we had to do this desperate attempt to regain our freedom.
And is that also put in the bigger narrative of sort of like, are there links to now? Or is that at least like implicit about sort of the nationalism? And because now, of course, there's also some criticism of the European Union, for example, in the
So to make it very short, the date of opening of the museum is not incidental. 2004 is exactly the year we've joined the European Union, and these two subjects overlap in a fascinating manner. So after finally reaching the EU, we've achieved the most ambitious goal we had, and it was perfect time to start this revisionist, past-oriented phase of the transition. And for many right-wing politicians, EU was either, this is Eurosceptic approach, either a new version of the Third Reich or just a due repayment for Yalta and Tehran. So we come back to Europe after they have left us behind.
Thank you. Then there is one more question, and perhaps Radmila, if you could mute yourself, because I think there's some sound. Thank you. There was one question from Ancient John Stark. Do you, and it's also a question to Maria if she wants to add, have the sense that the general public is aware daily and of the multiple narratives and the contrasting memory of the uprising, and also if Warsaw residents are actively engaged in redefining the memory in the 2020-2021 context of populist and nationalist surges?
If I were to answer, the answer would be no. And it's very interesting because they were before 2004, before the memory was redefined. When you heard Warsaw Uprising, it immediately triggered doubt. And now it triggers pride.
If I may add something, which is, I think, something that is necessary to say in the context of the question about the populist and populism and nationalism and so on, to give you something like a general context of some changes in the Polish memory culture since 2004, we have to mention that, this memory of the Warsaw Uprising that could look like as something very radical, very, let's say, highly controversial and so on, then on, can now be seen as something which is just too soft, too little pride and memory. And for that reason, the recent, let's say, memory boom in Poland is that which is aimed at the commemoration of the anti-communist resistance fighters after the World War II. This is about, the groups of soldiers that somehow continued their combat after the end of the war, fighting armed against the government of this pro-Soviet Polish country well into the 50s. And their history is tragic on one hand and really controversial on the other, because it's connected with multiple stories of violence, of ethnic cleansings or attempts on ethnic cleansings, let's say. And now they are seen as these really radical heroes who are somehow more radical than the home army that just ceased to fight in 1945. So I would say that from my point of view as a memory scholar, I used to perceive the Warsaw Uprising Museum and the memory of the Warsaw Uprising as something which is really, a representative of this conservative thread in Polish culture. And now I can observe it's somehow moving to the center, because there are much more radical phenomena to follow.
Thank you very much for elaborating on that. I see that there are also like two persons who have their hands up. So Chaling Wietsma, can I give you the floor?
Yes. Thank you both very, very much. I very much also like the presentations because it was sort of this both content and form. I wanted to talk a little bit or ask you how the form of the museum also influences the content. So which perspectives do you identify with the symbolism of the beating heart and connected? And also to the organizers of the project, I'm curious how they deal with this intersection between form and content in their eventual toolkits, or what their approach is. And secondly, I was also very curious, I liked that you brought up the European dimension. And once again, I'm also curious how these competing memories on the European dimension and sort of the memory modes that the EU uses, how that's dealt with within this broader project. Thank you very much.
So definitely the museum is created according to the principle the form follows the content, and it really combines the two perfectly. So the idea was to create this bridge between generations, young people 60 years ago and young people now. And the result was a really stunning success. And it resonated with young people. About the European narrative, it's very interesting because European narrative was built on this promise, and it was very strongly prospective narrative. Let's leave behind what divides us and create a better future. And for a long time, this narrative was also a main driving organizing form in Poland and other Central European countries. What we witness now in Poland after 2004, and the Warsaw Uprising Museum is an important part of the turn here, is disappointment and sometimes even rejection of this prospective perspective. The time is again perceived as a circle, not as a straight line that can take us to new places. So it's very well described in the new book by Krastev and Holmes, The Light That Failed. Before 2004, we mainly have politics of imitation. So if we will imitate the West, we will get better and create more affluent society and live better and so on and so forth. After 2004, for the first time, there was a very strong proposition that we should build on focusing on the past, on our roots, on pride, not on achieving certain material goals. And now it's very strong that there are some things that we can offer to Europe because the Europe has forgotten its own identity. And now we can again be this bulwark of Europe, the place of resistance against alien, hostile, foreign threat. And the Warsaw Uprising, also the Battle of Warsaw of 1920, also the Siege of Vienna, are remembered as these prefigurations of the current situation. But this is definitely a topic for a completely different lecture.
Perhaps I can then also respond like quickly on behalf of the project about the question between the form and the content, because I think this is especially like useful for these tours, because I mean, I personally find it fascinating, all the things that Marcin highlighted about how the narrative in a way is being promoted and pushed in the museum. If you can see about, and that also came through from like the presentation that Maria gave, it already starts by looking purely from the perspective of the insurgents. So what about the other perspectives? But then also what means are there? And if you take the example of the little insurgent, I mean, there's a lot to break down there. If like, why would you indeed like put a child soldier on a pedestal and present it in such a way? Like, why would you give a gun? So I think these forms are perfectly suitable for deconstructions And I think it's a great opportunity for like good education, and to sort of, you can literally deconstruct the narrative there and say, challenge students, okay, if you would give a more balanced view, what would you do? Which facts are left out, or what questions are not asked? And I think there are a lot of tools here. I mean, the big question, the big controversy, was the Warsaw Uprising worth it, is still something that you can ask at the end of a tour. So I see a lot of educational potential there.
But the question is never asked at the end of the tour by official tour guides. Actually, I have witnessed few foreign groups that after finishing the tour with the official tour guide were certain that we, the Poles, actually won the uprising. That's surprising, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So there you need to know the history about like what happened afterwards, and there's a lot to deconstruct. I'll give one more time the floor to Anna, and I would like, and there are some like final questions in the chat. Perhaps Grace, can I also ask you to open like the poll, because we have some questions before you leave that we would appreciate you answering. But I do want to stop really at the whole hour to respect everybody's time. So then, Anna, the floor is yours. And if we are not able to answer all the questions from the chat, then I'll make sure that Marcin answers them via email. So Anna.
Thank you so much for this tour. It was really fascinating. My question is about whether you have looked in guest books. I assume that there are some, whether you ever had questions about user perspective and what is the general trend, how people evaluate the exhibition on the example of guest books. And another question, a short one, really short one, is there ever perspective of any other Central Eastern European country presented, for example, events of Budapest, which could be also brought as a similar case? Is it exclusively Polish thing, or some other perspective ever present in this museum or in the discourse?
So I have never analyzed guest books, unfortunately. At some part during my project, I have analyzed reviews on the internet portals, and basically they are very positive, both by foreigners and Polish people. And this museum gets a very positive press, and in many respects is a work very well done. And they work also as an institution. They publish many books, and is a very vivid institution. And the answer about the more Central European context is basically no. We have some interesting cameos, like there were a group of Slovak soldiers that actually surprisingly joined the uprising in the middle of the uprising, and this is highlighted. But also, as Maria mentioned, there is a part where John Paul II and his pilgrimage to Poland is presented on the exhibition. And at this part, there is a direct link created between 1944 and Solidarity Movement and the collapse of Iron Curtain and Berlin Wall. So this is somehow situating the Warsaw Uprising as the beginning of the end of communism, like a prefiguration again.
Okay, thank you. So I'll take two questions at the same time. They're both about the materials that are being used. And the first question is from Olga Sabueleva. What is the proportion of authentic material objects and supportive media, replicas in the narrative? And the final one is from Alan Martel. Whether any digital technologies that visitors can also experience, like kiosk or augmented reality apps, personal recommendation systems?
So the answers are very simple. There are almost no original exhibits on the exhibition. And at the beginning, it was very suspicious for many visitors, and even more because the idea to create the museum is very, very, very old. And since the 50s, there were collections created of interesting objects and items, and people have given them for different foundations. And then when the museum was created, a lot of veterans expected the gifts to be featured on the exhibition. And I actually analyzed letters of these people who were writing like, I have this fascinating coat that was like a magic coat. You can turn it on the other side and it resembled a German officer coat, and I use it to hide. And fascinating story, why the hell is my coat not on the exhibition? And instead of that, there are like some, fake buildings and beating heart, and it was complicated. And this is a part of these new museums. But, and here's my answer to the second question, the museum is not really saturated with touchscreens and augmented reality. It's a blessing because it was created relatively early, 2004. It was before YouTube and the year the Facebook was created. It was really a different era. And contrary to other museums that were created later, even a few years later in Warsaw, and these new museums are unbearable. The touchscreens are old-fashioned and broken all the time. And when you try to use a modern technology in the museum, because the process of creating museum is relatively long, it becomes a museum of technology itself. And while you're opening the museum, the technology will always be outdated. So if you're planning a museum, don't do that. Everybody has a touchscreen in their pocket, and you don't have to show people, whoa, we have touchscreens now.